Hello, this is Graeme Daniels again. This is the second of two videos so far about the topic of sex addiction and psychoanalysis. I am a psychoanalytic psychotherapist and the co-author of a book entitled Getting Real About Sex Addiction, which I wrote with a fellow therapist by the name of Joe Farley, MFT. We are therapists in Northern California. And both of us have worked in the field of addictions for a long time, myself over 20 years in fields of addictions, sex addiction, and also chemical dependency to a large degree, though this video will focus on sex addiction in particular and psychoanalysis. And our subtitle of our book, which is A Psychodynamic Approach to Treatment. Psychodynamic, as I indicated in the first video, is an umbrella term of the range of psychoanalytic theories, as made famous originally by the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, the most famous name still in modern psychology. And part of the purpose of this series of videos is to make the point that in the field of addiction treatment, and even in peripheral entities like the 12-step movement, the influence of psychoanalysis is real. Indeed, I would make the argument that most of the ideas, theories that consumers of treatment would come across, or that practitioners would put into practice, are derived from psychoanalytic theories. So I'm going to just put up our book to start off with. Here is the cover of the book, Getting Real About Sex Addiction. It was published through Rowman and Littlefield, prominent author, publisher of psychology books. And you can't quite see the small print. The blurb there, or the paragraph, refers to this being an introduction to psychoanalytic ways of thought about addiction, and a lot of case illustrations in different formats of psychotherapy, not just individual therapy, but couples work to some degree, and also group therapy being very prominent in the treatment of addictions as a whole. And also a little bit of social commentary, touch on what is commonly termed these days intersectionality, to in particular address matters relating to gender and what are some matters of gender bias, perhaps, in the field of sex addiction treatment. But this video will continue to focus mostly on sex addiction and psychoanalysis, intro to its theories, make sense of them. For you, next slide is going to be, the next piece is going to be about where sex addiction is currently, its status in the field of mental health care, which also covered a little bit in the first video. It is, as many viewers will know, it's not a diagnosis in the American Psychoanalytic Association's Diagnostic Standards Manual, which was the latest edition of which was published in 2013. There was, however, a proposed diagnosis. It wasn't called sex addiction. It was called hypersexual disorder, as indicated here. And it was rejected. And I'm not going to go into the details of why it was rejected. That's a little bit on my pay grade to declare what that is, although it's subject to a lot of speculation in the field. But the proposed diagnosis, it's interesting that its language featured criteria that is very, very reminiscent of psychoanalytic theory or premises of psychoanalytic treatment. That repetitive urges, fantasies, behaviors are in response to stressful events or dysphoric mood states. That's a paraphrasing of how analytic theory would address the matter of addiction, which is as a substitutive action. An addiction is a substitute, a displacement for an instinctual gratification. Freudian terms meant that which pertains to sex or aggression. And I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go along. So, sex addiction, what Freud would have called perversions, prostitute seeking, affair seeking, pornography or voyeurism, exhibitionism, fetishism, these are all would have been deemed perversions. And today we tend to think of them not as perversions, but under the heading of sex addiction, which has become a very popular term to characterize the sort of deviant sexuality in the last generation. Now, the World Health Organization does have a diagnostic category designated for, again, not sex addiction, but what they call compulsive sexual behavior. CSBD indicated here in parentheses, and that is a part of their ICD-11 diagnostic categories system. And you might also, if you're studying this field, come across the terms like, plainer terms like problem sexual behaviors to indicate, sort of assessment categories really under the sex addiction umbrella. Sex addiction has become sort of a shorthand, somewhat informally to cover all of these. And the CSBD category is characterized as a, quote, persistent pattern of failure to control intense, repetitive sexual urges leading to repetitive sexual behavior. I mean, that really touches on what is, for many, the kind of sine qua non of addiction, this idea of loss of control. I think an average view of addiction is that you're an addict if you have lost control of some behavior, even though that is maybe invariably defined. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, which will come to Sigmund Freud. No, I'm going to touch on Patrick Carnes first. That's right. Long after Sigmund Freud was Patrick Carnes, who is more or less the figure who popularized or proselytized, depending on your point of view, the notion of sex addiction through two seminal works in the 80s and early 90s, respectively. The first, Out of the Shadows, the second, Don't Call It Love, in which he sort of proposed the idea of sex addiction alongside case vignettes. Characterized as a sex addict as one who believes that sex is his most important need, not surprising. I think Sigmund Freud would have said something very similar 100 years ago. Is beset with certain, quote, core beliefs. This is very much a kind of an idea that conjures cognitive behavioral therapy, which is probably the most dominant paradigm of psychotherapy to treat sex addiction. So if you think of going to a therapist and they give you a workbook, for example, and they ask questions, or you give them questionnaires, and the idea is for you to sort of reflect, of course, with exercises that rather presuppose that you can have conscious memory of a lot of the events. Has core beliefs, and I don't think Carnes necessarily expresses whether they are conscious or unconscious. I think a lot of people in the field of psychology more or less accept the idea that certain core beliefs can be at least semi-conscious. One of them would be the idea that I am not worthwhile. Certainly you might think of as a shame state there, or a dysphoric mood state, dysphoric meaning negative, and uses sex to avoid painful, empty feelings. So what I'm arguing here is that these are rather derivative notions of the idea originally really taught in psychoanalysis, that contrary to what, say, a medical model would say of dependency, addiction is a secondary phenomenon, meaning a defense against negative mood states. And that's more or less what is being expressed here by these more modern writers, theorists. Carnes further asserts that sexual behaviors that is secretive is likely addictive. So another kind of sine qua non, sort of salient factor in addiction. I think this one's a bit more controversial, is the idea that it is secretive. I think secrecy pertains to whether something is forbidden, more so than it does whether it is addictive. There's a point of debate in the field. Carnes is the founder of an organization called the International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals, which seeks to sort of organize particularly the field of sex addiction. He established what's called a CSAT credential, which is a certificate denoting a certain number of hours. I can't say precisely. I think it's something like 20 hours of education, 30 hours of supervisory oversight of cases that are worked on. I'm making this point not to sort of delineate the CSAT credential, but actually to say that it's a rather slight credential, in my opinion. CSAT, you can't get a CSAT just on its own. You have to be a licensed mental health professional first in order to get one. I think most psychotherapists who have years of education and then years of training to become licensed are essentially qualified to treat sex addiction. And I don't accept the idea that you actually need a certificate of additional hours to be qualified to talk to people about addiction and certainly not sexuality. They are core elements within training for the psychotherapist anyway. People are going to disagree with that. That's all right. A little bit of science, some notable science that is in support of the sex addiction idea is through a researcher by the name of Dr. Valerie Voon, headed research team finding that male subjects, it's notable, I'll come to that in another video to sort of touch on gender bias, diagnosed with CSB meaning compulsive sexual behavior, were more activated than control subjects meaning non-consensual sexual behavior figures, in areas of the brain linked with the processing of reward and emotion. So this long-held idea that addictive behaviors are dopaminergic. It has to do with them activating neurotransmitters like dopamine, and that you get addicted to a pleasurable response, the pleasurable reward, and that this phenomenon is similar to that of substance dependence. Well, now we will come to Sigmund Freud, who was speaking, at least theoretically, of these ideas a century ago. Then people can argue which would be the first works that he wrote, famous works in which he would have introduced the idea of addiction or alluded to addiction. 3 essays on sexuality in 1905, perhaps, where we learn about the oral, anal, genital stages of psychosexuality. Some might nominate that. I'm going to cite 2 principles of mental functioning in 1911 as the most significant first publication to reference pleasure principle and reality principle. The pleasure principle, the purpose, the aim of a mind is to discharge, to seek pleasure, and correspondingly to reduce tension and keep the human psyche at a state of low excitation, to seek pleasure and reduce tension. Pleasure is a diminishing of that tension and excitation. And the reality principle is that human beings must learn to postpone pleasure because of the demands of the material world, as he would have put it. You could argue that that's an allusion to what he later termed the superego, the demands of society, or the ego, demands of reality. The postponement of pleasure has the purpose of also safeguarding pleasure, Freud argued. You get more pleasure if it's in reward and if it's been delayed gratification. And what we commonly associate with addicts is that they do not postpone pleasure. They seek what we term immediate gratification. But the common idea of postponing pleasure is more or less integrated into society. Think of, say, the happy hour notion of 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday. Why at that time? Because that's the end of the work week as decreed by the superego that is established civilized society. And that thinking which represents a wish in Freud's thinking, but thinking, the ability to use our minds, is how we cope with drives and affects coming from the body, coming from our psyche. We sublimate, we repress. And this is the experience of the average neurotic, which is, you could think of that as a pathologizing term, but it's more or less representing, the normalcy of human experience versus, say, psychosis, which is, abnormal psychology. Normal, healthy human beings repress. That is, we turn away from that which is uncomfortable. That is both defensive, but Freud would have argued that it is normative behavior. Repression was actually positive. It's necessary for civilization. It wouldn't necessarily make us happy. He later argued in one of his famous climactic works, Civilization and Its Discontents. Being discontent, being neurotic, is the price we pay for being civilized. Now, in treatment, getting a little away from the kind of the heady expanse of what creates civilization, when I see patients in my office, when we're treating people with day-to-day, week-to-week difficulties, people are talking about their lives, and defense mechanisms, turning away from uncomfortable. That which is uncomfortable is a normative, commonplace part of experience. It's not just the pathology of an addict. Undoing, reaction formation, displacement, these are sort of commonplace defense mechanisms. What we're really saying of an addict is, because of their excessive or repetitive drive towards pleasure seeking, these defenses are correspondingly used more, because they need to defend against the uncomfortable, the tension buildup that is increased within them. What is undoing? Undoing is the taking back, the pulling back of uncomfortable thoughts and wishes that is commonplace. A person becomes confused, scrambles the signal, as I sometimes call it to one of my patients, because you uttered a thought, you uttered a wish. And believe it or not, commonplace wishes, ambition, assertiveness are troubling for individuals. So when they utter a thought, they take it back. They aren't necessarily, perverted, unhealthy thoughts. Commonplace assertiveness can be difficult for people. That's why they're neurotic. So we undo a lot. Did I do that? Did I say that? Is what I just said making sense? We hear people say. Reaction formation is a kind of fancy term for our tendency towards judgment, tendency towards negative judgment. We take on the superego, even those who are prone, to acting out behaviors. And I'll say what I mean by acting out in just a moment. Acting out, judgment. We judge people for doing what is, in ourselves. And addicts are prone to this as well. Somebody who is in the aftermath of a traumatic episode in which a near catastrophic accident nearly occurred, goes to a child who is responsible for the addict and wants to sort of teach them a lesson about how to be more careful in the future, and finds that this child doesn't want to talk about the accident, doesn't want to think about it, wants to go play video games. And this person, adult figure, becomes indignant. Well, how are they going to learn? How are they going to ever take things seriously? How are they going to learn accountability if what they want to do is just disappear and escape? That's coping, says the other parent. No, it is denial, it is escapism. But here's the secret. This person who is in the judgmental position is himself prone to similar escapist behaviors. So reaction formation, we assert a position that is a reversal, actually, what is in our own minds. A person who is feeling needy, for example, feeling vulnerable, might take a position of judgment, of negative judgment to others who are needy, others who are vulnerable, others who are quote unquote weak. It's a very commonplace observations, and it's derived from Freud's observation of this thing he called reaction formation. And displacement, which has in its kind of in modern form manifest in a very famous book title, I think, this defense mechanism. It basically means taking, displacing onto trivial matters or things the headline stresses of our life. Don't sweat the small stuff, a famous author called John Gray. Well, the reason we sweat the small stuff, Mr. Gray, Dr. Gray, is because, the big stuff is too hard to deal with. So In therapy and analysis, people come into our offices and they'll talk about all manner of stressors, trivial, the not quite so trivial, but they'll talk about lots of things, but before they will talk about the most stressful thing that's actually happened in their life. We don't want to think about that. So we displace onto relatively lesser stressors. Now, Freud thought that, for example, that sex addiction, what he would probably have thought of sex addiction is that it represents a range of perverse behaviors, again, exhibitionism, voyeurism, prostitute seeking, etc., even affair seeking, the polymorphously perverse behavior. All of these as substitutive displacements against the most forbidden, sexual act. No, not rape. You probably would have thought that forbidden also, but actually incest was the meaning of this famous Oedipal myth. Okay, but rather than go further in depth with that, let's point out that perhaps the most important theoretical idea that Freud came upon relating to addiction is repetition compulsion, which he represented in works like Mourning and Melancholia, which is about sort of idea of object loss, object meaning caregiver, and also in Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, the idea of death instinct, that we are prone towards self-destructive behaviors and reenacting traumatic events. And the original traumas of our lives are loss of or separation from our original caregiving figures, parents. So the idea of addiction becomes not just about pleasure seeking, but coping with some manner of significant loss and trauma being synonymous terms here. The commonplace ways of being in the world for the addict. We must talk about Melanie Klein's idea of splitting. Melanie Klein, probably the second most important or famous person in the history of psychoanalysis, really expanded on Freud's notion of splitting, which had to do with just altered states of consciousness, by casting it as what's called an intrapsychic defense system, keeping separate that which is good and bad in the mind so as to achieve a sort of state of omnipotence, of certainty, a kind of psychic security. Today we would think of these in a derivative form as things like black and white thinking, rigid thinking. We put a positive spin on this, we call it decisiveness, our desire and our need to know, our anxiety about ambivalence and about not knowing. The addict wants to know. It wants to undo uncertainty, doesn't want to feel uncertainty, doesn't want to feel ambivalence. The splitting gets rid of negative feeling. In the object loss aspect of object relations theory, the addict never has to experience loss because of the perpetual availability, the omnipresence of addictive substances. And this might lead the listener to think of modern society, and particularly the digital age, how readily available addictive substances are, addictive sex, addictive anything. Society increasingly is enabling, I think is the modern term for this. Now, in a famous book called, famous paper rather, called Notes on Schizoid Mechanisms, Melanie Klein also introduced a concept called projective identification, which is a concept picked up by this figure, Wilfred Bion, another British psychoanalyst, who nuanced Melanie Klein's idea of projective identification, which has to do with depositing one's experience into another. The field of sex addiction treatment, this has a derivative idea called inducement. That's how it's referred to. But addicts sort of, deposit their split off states, as it's called in analytic, their denied states into others, particularly around sexuality and aggression and anxiety. So the addict acts out, it's another Freudian term actually, you act out thoughts and feelings versus remembering them and being conscious of them. I wrote about that in 1914. And their underlying anxious states and underlying aggressions are split off, is the idea, and deposited into another, so that the feelings get induced into another. So you think of the state of the so-called betrayed or impacted partner. He, or typically she, because of the demographics of sex addiction treatment, absorbs the anxiety and absorbs the anger, the self-righteous anger, as it is often experienced by addicts, of feeling betrayed and let down by the acting out figure. And this idea of projective identification, which again it exists now in derivative form in modern sort of addiction circles. You might think of it as Bion thought of it, as a means of primitive communication. The plainest example we can think of in everyday terms is the idea of I take out my feelings on somebody else. It's a sort of variation of displacement. I take it out on them. And the person of taking it out on them and the purpose of snapping at somebody of an outburst is not just to control them, as Klein supposed, and that may be the case, but it's also this primitive form of communication. I can only make you feel what I feel by inducing in you the feelings that I'm having, but that I can't experience or express directly. That's how Wilfred Bion might have thought of a sex addict. So that's perhaps enough for now. I'm going to bring that to the main screen. Here I am back again. I will do some more videos at another time, sort of expand from psychoanalysis and want to discuss sort of some social intersectionality concerns, particularly as it relates to gender bias in the field. I have some things to say about that and about the treatment as it's directed at impacted or betrayed partners as well. So if you've liked or intrigued by what you've heard so far, click a like, subscribe to those YouTube-y kind of things, and perhaps I'll see you next time. All right, thank you for listening.